teaser of this session today. There are these gaps between what scientists understand and what the general public understands. They're in a myriad of areas, so whether it's safe to eat GMOs or whether climate change is caused by human activity, whether vaccines are safe. Why are there these gaps, and what can we do about it? Barbara Hofer and I recently wrote a book where we talked about what are the psychological aspects that create this situation of doubt, denial, and resistance of science, and the action steps we can take. Today on our panel, we're going to hear specifically about particular interventions and approaches that help us confront this scourge of science denial. I want to call your attention to a couple of strategies. You'll hear some of these today, and others you need to look into. Debunking. So there's a strategy that we can use where you basically inoculate people against misinformation. Debunking. I encourage everyone who's interested in this field to download the Debunking Handbook, which several of us here on this panel were engaged in, that talks about the strategy of debunking and how to do it successfully without creating backfire effects. Refuting. A lot of us in this room have done work on reputations and how to do those successfully, also without creating backfire effects. So you're going to hear about these and many other strategies today. I also want to note that Doug and I and many other people here today have worked on sourcing, and this is such an important factor. How do we teach students to find information they need and to be able to vet it? And digital literacy is something that we all need to be concerned about. So what are some steps we need to take in confronting this scourge of science doubt, denial, and resistance? Confront misconceptions. Reduce the uncertainty in people's understanding of science and how it works. Make sure that we're creating personal relevance to the information we share, connect what we do to these current issues, make sure we're triggering positive emotions and reducing negative emotions, and most of all, empower people to take action. Along that line, before our first speaker, I'd like to remind you that today at 11 o'clock, after this session concludes, I welcome you all to a main stage event about what psychologists can do to contribute to the climate crisis.
Perfect, yeah.
Our first speaker is David.
Okay, hi everybody. It's great to see you in person. It's so wonderful to have folks to talk with one-on-one or in a big group like this. I wanted to acknowledge my co-author, Megan Amundo, who's sitting right here. We were really interested in this idea of fair and balanced journalism. So journalists, editors, and audiences are really interested in and hope to see fair and balanced reporting, which is the case where two sides are offered on a position and they have equivalently valid and evidenced ideas that then get competed against and argued about and debated to lead to some understanding and resolution. But the challenge is, oftentimes in these kinds of reports where two positions are shown, one side is more substantiated and one side is less substantiated, one side will have more evidence, the other side will have less evidence in support of it. And this creates a situation called false balance, sometimes it's called false equivalency. You actually see this in the news quite a bit, and we were interested in this and thinking about it with global warming and climate change. Even on stations you might really like, whether you watch Fox or listen to NPR, you'll hear reports where individuals will be brought about to talk about climate change. You only get one scientist who believes climate change is something to worry about and be concerned about, and another person who'll say it's not something we should be that worried about. And positioning those two people as authorities suggests there's an equivalent base of evidence and equivalent consensus among the scientific community about the issue. So we wanted to see, are there actual psychological consequences to these kinds of false balance reports? And we decided to look at this with climate change, although you can imagine looking at it with a host of issues. Climate change just turns out to be a place and a field within which you've seen a lot of false balance reporting, at least up until about 2 or 3 years ago, where it's drastically dropped, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But we opted to use climate change as our area. So the general method for the research project, again, we're trying to understand what are the psychological consequences of exposure to false balance reports using climate change as our topic. The general method is we're going to have participants read transcripts of interviews from experts. Sometimes the experts are consensus science experts, meaning they believe climate change is the thing to be worried about, concerned about. Some evidence suggests 98% of climate scientists say this is something to be concerned about and we should be building action towards. Sometimes people read transcripts from contrarian views, who are people saying climate change is something not to be worried about, and in fact we also manipulate potentially the source credibility of the contrarian person. They could be a climate scientist, they could be a scientist who doesn't study climate change at all, they could be someone who's a non-expert. And people might also read control transcripts that are not about climate change or about black holes, so unrelated. What we're going to do in this study is people are going to be reading 2 transcripts, one after the other, and we're going to want to see how does this change people's beliefs in and thoughts about climate change. We're going to be using 2 measures in this study called the PECs and the GWIBs. Let me explain what they are. The PECs is the Perceived Expert Consensus Scale. And this is a battery of questions that's designed to ask people, what do you think the scientific consensus about is with respect to climate change? So do you believe it's more in favor or less in favor? Questions like that. The GWIBs is Global Warming Belief Scale. This is essentially people's concerns about and beliefs in global warming as something to be thinking about, worried about, and realize there are consequences of. So we're going to be using the PECs and GWIBs to see what happens when people are exposed to these transcripts. And the way the method is going to work is people are going to fill out the PECs and GWIBs before they read any transcripts. Then they're going to read pairs of transcripts. And then they're going to fill out the PECs and GWIBs again. And we're going to see if there's any change in PECs and GWIB scores after being exposed to consensus and contrarian views. And specifically for this study, we're interested in false balance cases where you get consensus and contrarian, one after the other in a single presentation. Okay, so this is a little hard to see. Can I grab that? Thanks. Well, don't worry, I'll walk you through it. And I promise I'm a reliable source for these data. And if I'm not, you can ask me. So in experiment 1, I'm going to try to show you 3 experiments. We see if I have enough time for it. Experiment 1, we have 717 participants to fill out the PECs and GWIBs, read 2 transcripts, and then fill out the PECs and GWIBs again. And what I'm going to orient you to is this column, and again, I'll walk you through it if you can't see it. We're going to be looking at change in PEC scores, again, perceived expert consensus, and change in GWIB scores, global warming belief scale, after reading. And what I want to start out with is one-sided presentations. These are cases where people are reading one either consensus or contrarian transcript, and then a control text. So that's going to allow us to see if you just read a contrarian or consensus view, does that change how you think about these issues? Okay, so it's pretty small, but what I want to show you is anytime you see a negative score, it means decreases in PECs and GWIBs, which means they believe less in scientific consensus and are less concerned about climate change. Anytime you see a positive score, it means they're more concerned about climate change and they believe there is more expert consensus in favor of climate change being a thing. The first row is if people read just control texts, we don't see any change in terms of PECs and GWIB scores. Makes sense, they're not reading anything about climate change. If they read a consensus text and a control text, we see positive change. People start to give higher scores in the PECs and GWIBs at that second test point. But anytime someone gets a contrarian text, again, paired with just a control text, those scores decrease. And actually, it doesn't matter if that text is written by, or the transcript is involving an interview with, an expert climate scientist, an expert scientist who doesn't study climate science, or a non-expert. In all 3 of those cases, we get decreases in PECs and GWIB scores, and the scores are less of a decrease with the non-expert than the expert, as you might expect. But the big question is, what happens when you present, I keep wanting to switch with this, what happens when you present a consensus and contrarian text together? Again, we get decreases. And we counterbalance this, so sometimes you read the consensus transcript first, sometimes you read the contrarian expert first. It doesn't matter the credibility of that contrarian source. As long as you pair those materials together, people's scores on PECs and GWIBs goes down. So that suggests false equivalence experiences leads to decreases in beliefs about whether climate change matters. Now in experiment 2, we focus specifically on people reading 3 different pairs of text. So some participants read a pair that was a consensus climate scientist and a contrarian expert climate scientist. Some people read an expert consensus climate scientist and a non-expert contrarian, and then some people read 2 control texts. So we just have 3 different sets of materials here. So the graph's going to be a little easier to see than that previous figure. But this time we want to see, is there a way for us to decrease that decrease we're seeing in terms of agreement and belief? So can we attenuate the effects of being exposed to a contrarian text and make the PECs and GWIB scores not go down as much, right? Make them more positive. And the way we want to do that is a kind of debunking, which is called a weighted evidence statement. So this is after people are reading the transcripts, we give them a statement that says, by the way, we just want to let you know, the expert consensus among climate scientists is that climate change is occurring and negatively affecting our planet. That's it. They read this statement, after reading the 2 transcripts. So it's a reminder of the status of scientific belief and scientific expert consensus. And again, we want to see, does that reduce the likelihood people's PECs and WIB scores are going to drop so precipitously? And here are the data. This I'm going to show you in a graph, and it's pretty confusing, but again, I'll walk you through it to make sure you understand it. What I'm going to be showing you on the x-axis here, we have pairs of texts. So it's people reading in the first, I'll just walk to it. In the first one, maybe this works. In the first one, right? So we're looking at climate experts and contrarian experts. So consensus contrarian experts. In this one, we're looking at consensus experts and contrarian non-experts. And this one, 2 control texts, okay? And the first thing I want to orient you to are the light blue bars. So these 3 bars. And again, anything that's negative suggests they now have less of a belief there's consensus and less of a belief that climate change is a thing. And everything above that line suggests they believe more in climate change and they believe more in expert consensus. So the blue bars show you when you're exposed to a contrarian expert source, those scores go down. But the dark blue bars are cases where people also received a weight of evidence statement, and you say the blue bars don't get as much of a drop. We attenuate the negative consequences of being exposed to a contrarian source if you hear about the weight of evidence statement. And we get that both for PEGs and WIBs. Okay, so this one is for the PEG score, this is for WIBs. Again, the most risky condition is the condition where you get a climate consensus expert and a contrarian consensus expert. You get the most precipitous drops in PEGs and WIB scores. But when you get the weight of evidence, you get some attenuation. In fact, you can remediate the problem of being exposed to those contrarian sources. 2 minutes? Okay, perfect. I can get through 3. 3 experiments. So the third experiment, what we want to do is we've been hearing from people and even our own observations that false equivalency presentations among climate science has dropped, or at least the general public has a better awareness in the last couple of years of climate science being something to be concerned about than they did previously. So we conducted experiment 3 during August 2021, which is a period of massive warmth around the country. Our participants were recruited from the US through MTurk, I should mention it. And basically we wanted to see, are we going to have the same kind of consequences now that people are more aware that climate change at least is something that's out there? They might not necessarily have policy advocations or really believe or know how to even deal with it, but at least being aware that this is something to be worried about. And because science has been much more prevalent in discussing, you'll hear constantly, just as Gail presented, that climate scientists generally agree on this, right? The overwhelming preponderance of evidence is that climate change is happening. 98% of scientists by some measures. So we wanted to see in this experiment, do we get the same negative effects of contrarian presentations because people are now getting more consensus presentations. And because I wasn't sure I was going to have enough time, I don't have the graph up there, but basically we get the same effects. When contrarian sources are paired with consensus sources, you get drops in PEGs and WIBs, but not to the same degree we got in experiment 2. So you get decreases in belief in climate change and decreases in expert consensus, but not to the degree we saw back in our original data in 2018. So people are starting to become more aware, but you still get these negative consequences. And importantly, the weight of evidence statement helps attenuate those effects. So, in summary, exposure to contrarian views can influence people's beliefs about scientific consensus, as well as people's personal beliefs about the scientific topic. Specifically here, we're looking at climate change. We're now having setting up some new experiments to look at other scientific topics, and not just for the reason that this is the biggest piece of research I've ever done that's gotten the most hate mail from random people just emailing me out of nowhere thinking I'm a climate scientist, which I'm not. In a sense, we use climate science as our context to study the issue of false equivalency. So now we're going to be looking at other contexts to see if the same kind of effects emerge. Like we're thinking about Lyme's disease, right? There's a consensus from the medical community, and then there's these contrarian views that suggest it's not a thing or the symptoms aren't the same. So we're going to be looking at this with other areas. And importantly, the weight of evidence reminder can ameliorate the influence of these kinds of contrarian presentations. If you're interested in this project, it was recently published in JARMAC, Journal of Applied Research in Memory and Cognition. You can email me or Megan, and we're happy to share the paper with you, and I'll stop there.
Hello. So I'm Victoria Johnson, and today I'm presenting on how to trust and what to believe effects of political ideology. This work was done with Reese Butterfuss and Pani Kandeyu. So we're switching gears here and going into vaccination rather than climate change. So while the COVID-19 vaccines presented an opportunity to combat the spread of COVID-19, many are still unwilling to receive the vaccine. And one of the greatest threats to vaccination is misconceptions about vaccine safety, as people who report higher mistrust of vaccines are less willing to get vaccinated. While historically bipartisan, in the United States, the politicization of the COVID-19 pandemic has also politicized vaccination information and the public's trust in scientific sources. Specifically, reports suggest that conservatives show higher vaccine hesitancy than liberals, consistent with evidence that trust in science has decreased in conservatives over the past few decades. And in addition, people seek scientific information not just from scientific institutions themselves, but also from mainstream media sources that differ in their epistemic orientations, as well as partisanship, and how they cover scientific issues such as COVID-19, which may influence individuals' trust in information sources. So, therefore, in this study, we examined how different information sources, liberal media versus conservative media versus scientific, interact with individuals' epistemic beliefs and political ideologies to influence their trust in sources of vaccination information. Our study included 133 liberals and 354 conservatives. 18 statements about vaccines were presented based on those in Trevor's and Candeo 2020. Half the claims were inaccurate and half were accurate. Statements were then presented as being allegedly from liberal sources, here Huffington Post or MSNBC, conservative sources, American Conservative or Fox News, or then scientific institutions, so the World Health Organization or the National Institutes of Health. And then the source manipulation was fully crossed and counterbalanced, which created 3 sets of items to which participants were then randomly assigned. And after reading each statement, participants would rate their trust in the source on a 1 to 7 rating scale. And then participants also completed an epistemics beliefs measure, the Omnibus Survey for the School of Communication, OSOC by Garrett and Weeks, which consists of 12 items across 3 dimensions of epistemic beliefs. Faith and intuition, or the extent to which people rely on their own intuition to judge truth. Need for evidence, a person's need for evidence to judge truth. And then truth is political, the extent to which someone believes that facts are politically constructed. Participants also completed a new source prior knowledge measure to gauge their familiarity with the political bias of those sources and others, and they were aware of these biases. So then going to results, we conducted a series of mixed effects ANOVAs that included source, the conservative media versus liberal media versus scientific institution, individuals' political ideology, liberal versus conservative, and then their epistemic beliefs as variables, and trust ratings as the dependent measure. While there were no main effects, there was a source type by political ideology interaction, as you can see on the screen. So as you can see here, liberals tended to trust scientific sources significantly more than both their own liberal sources and conservative sources, whereas conservatives tended to trust scientific sources just as much as they did their own conservative partisan sources. In addition, all 3-way interactions between source type, political ideology, and epistemic beliefs were also significant. And for all these graphs going forward, you can see the trust ratings on the y-axis and then the dimensions of OSOC on the x-axis. So here we're looking at need for evidence. And on the screen we have the liberals. And here you can see participants who were higher in a need for evidence. Here we're talking 1 standard deviation above the mean. Tended to trust scientific sources the most, liberal sources in the middle, and then conservative sources the least. Participants, though, who were lower in a need for evidence, 1 standard deviation below the mean, did not differ in their trust across source types. In comparison, for conservatives, participants who were high in a need for evidence tended to trust conservative and scientific sources to the same exact extent, while those lower in need for evidence did not differ in their trust across source types. So putting this together, it suggests that both conservatives and liberals lower in need for evidence will not differentiate between trusting different sources of vaccination information. However, for those high in a need for evidence, liberals will trust scientific sources more than all other sources, while conservatives will trust their own partisan media to the same extent as the scientific sources. And then for truth is political, looking to liberals, participants who were higher in a belief that truth is political, again did not differ in their trust across source types, while those lower in a belief that truth is political tended to trust scientific sources the most, liberal sources in the middle, and then conservative sources the least. And then for conservatives, participants who were higher in a belief that truth is political did not differ in their trust across source types, while those lower in this belief tended to trust conservative and scientific sources more than liberal sources. So combined, we're seeing here that both conservatives and liberals higher in a belief that truth is political will not differentiate between trusting different sources of vaccination claims. However, for those lower in a belief that truth is political, liberals will trust scientific sources significantly more than all other sources, while conservatives will trust their own partisan media to the same extent as those scientific sources. And then finally, for faith and intuition, looking to liberals, participants who were higher in faith and intuition did not differ in their trust across source types, while those lower in faith and intuition tended to trust scientific sources the most, liberal sources in the middle, and then conservative sources the least. For conservatives, however, participants in general just tended to trust scientific sources more than liberal ones. So combined, this is suggesting that only liberals who are lower in faith and intuition tended to trust scientific sources significantly more than all partisan sources. Overall, we found that trust in vaccine claims is determined in part by complex interactions between partisanship, epistemic beliefs, and source type. More specifically, political ideology and epistemic beliefs were related but distinct constructs that interactively determine trust in sources of vaccination information. There were different patterns of trust among liberals and conservatives. Specifically, conservatives did not defer to science and believed and trusted conservative media just as much as they did scientific sources, regardless of their epistemic beliefs. Depending on those epistemic beliefs, some showed no sensitivity to source, while others regarded conservative sources as just equal to scientific sources, but in no place did they put scientific sources above their own partisan media. However, whether liberals deferred to science or not depended on their epistemic beliefs. In all complex interactions, there was a group of liberals who deferred to science, including those high in a need for evidence, those low in a belief that truth is political, and those low in faith and intuition. One implication of this pattern is that conservatives may not outright reject vaccination information from scientific institutions, but rather just value their own partisan sources to the same extent as those scientific sources. It may be that conservatives do not necessarily distrust scientific research itself, but rather see specific scientists as biased and therefore untrustworthy. And this follows COVID-19 data that suggests that conservative distrust in individuals is more than conservative distrust in science itself. And since we use scientific institutions in this study, it may be the case that conservatives view those institutions as a little bit more trustworthy and credible compared to if we had used actual scientists within the scientific community. And this pattern also suggests that while liberals in general are more discerning of sources of information than conservatives, this effect does depend on their epistemic beliefs. Some liberals also trust their own partisan sources to the same extent as scientific sources, and epistemic beliefs may overpower partisan categorizations in this domain. Should this result be replicated, there's a need to address a lack of deference to science for both conservatives and liberals when framing crucial scientific information. So overall, we found that the source of vaccination information matters when considering people's trust in sources of information. Therefore, science communicators must consider participants' political ideology as well as their beliefs about the nature of knowledge and knowing when communicating vaccination information. Understanding how these factors independently and interactively exert their influence could lead to more effective science communication and therefore reduce vaccine hesitancy and increase vaccine uptake. Thanks for listening.
Hi everybody, my name is Ronak Pillai, and today I want to talk about some work done with our collaborator, Dr. Jessica Collier, and my advisor, Dr. Lisa Fazio, looking at multiple choice quizzes as a possible intervention in terms of addressing misinformation. So to start, the reason we're all here sort of crammed in this room today is that we're interested in tools that we can use to address misconceptions and misinformation. I want to start by establishing that we already have a pretty good, well-evidenced sort of intervention that can be used, and that is fact checks. So numerous studies show that corrected messaging is an effective means of reducing belief in misinformation and increasing belief in true information. Now these fact checks can range anywhere from simple messages that state a claim and label it as true or false, all the way to more in-depth articles, which will be the focus of today's talk, that sort of give the history and context of the claim and talk about reasons why it may be accurate or inaccurate. Now with that being said, there are some limitations with fact checks. In particular, one I want to draw your attention to is that fact checks can wane in their efficacy over time. So oftentimes in studies, you'll find these very strong effects of fact checks immediately after people see them, but say a week, 3 weeks later, you'll start to see those effects decrease, sometimes being cut almost by half. And so that's sort of where we wanted to come in. We wanted to see if we can draw on insights in terms of what we know about improving memory from psychology to increase retention and the efficacy of fact checks over time. And to do that, we turn to the literature on multiple choice quizzing. Now there's a large literature that many of you are probably familiar with showing that multiple choice quizzes can be an effective strategy for studying information, both in the lab and in classroom settings. It's part of a broader phenomenon called the testing effect, in which when retrieving information from memory, it doesn't just measure what you know, it also is a way of reinforcing what's in there, especially when paired with corrective feedback. This form of studying can actually be more effective than simply rereading a passage. And so multiple choice quizzes are a particularly, or a potentially fruitful way of enhancing retention of fact checks, and that's exactly what we wanted to test in the work here. So we started by conducting a pair of experiments that were largely very similar, so I'll just describe one of them, that address this question of whether or not quizzing can improve the efficacy of fact checks by improving people's memory for the details in those fact checks. The way these studies worked is we showed people a series of fact checks. I have a screenshot of the preview of the top of one of them over here on the right. And as you can see, these are articles from that address health and medical misinformation. They were drawn from the Snopes.com website, a prominent fact-checking organization. Over here we have an example of one that debunks this false claim that was gaining a lot of traction on social media that sort of claims that marijuana can lead to complete remission of Crohn's disease. It was picked up by a number of celebrities, including, I think, Charlie Sheen is among them, so lots of people are seeing this on social media. And so what we did was we had people read these articles debunking this health and medical misconceptions, and we assigned some people to take a short 2-question multiple choice quiz, like what you see here over on the right, that addressed sort of specific details, such as the definition of complete remission from the doctor's perspective, maybe some information about why the original study was misinterpreted, how it was spread, things like that. And so what we were really interested in were 2 things. First, we were interested in the effects of quizzes on people's memory for the details of the article. So once you take a quiz, are you better able to remember the information that you studied in the passage? But then, and most importantly, we wanted to take that a step further and see if that increased memory would then translate into more accurate beliefs about the claim that was at the center of the fact check itself. So I'm going to go over those on the next 2 slides. So to start off, talking about the memory, the key takeaway that we see here is that quizzes improve memory for the details of the article. What I have here on the y-axis is the proportion of open-ended questions that address these key details that participants were able to answer correctly on a test that they took either immediately after seeing the fact check and potentially the quiz, or a week later. And as you can see, there's some forgetting over this time, but most importantly, the key takeaway is that when people take the quiz, their memory is much better. They're able to answer more of these detailed questions correctly. But that's not all we want people to take away from fact checks. We don't want them to just be able to recall specific details or definitions or things like that. We want them to also kind of take away the broader picture that the claim, here for instance, that marijuana, the false claim that marijuana leads to complete remission of Crohn's disease, we want people to take away that that is false. So that's the second thing that we measured. And we did that by showing people those claims and asking them to rate how inaccurate or accurate they were. And as you can see, we actually surprisingly don't find any effect, both on the immediate test and 1 week later. There's no effect of these quizzes on people's ratings of how accurate or inaccurate these false claims actually are. So we're left with this interim picture where quizzes are effective in terms of improving people's memory for details of a fact-checking article, but they're not effective at changing people's belief in the fact-check claims. So we wanted to do one more follow-up study to kind of address some lingering questions we had after doing this work. First question is it possible that our fact checks just weren't working? Again, like I mentioned, there's a large literature suggesting that fact checks do work, but potentially maybe we picked some stimuli that weren't very persuasive. Maybe these fact checks weren't affecting people's beliefs for one reason or another, and so increasing people's memory for details of them would not likely translate into more accurate beliefs. That's one thing we wanted to rule out, and we did that by adding an extra control condition in which we measured people's beliefs prior to reading any fact checks regarding the claims. Next thing we wanted to look at was whether these effects would differ across true and false claims. So in the previous studies, we looked at just false articles that debunked false claims, but now we also wanted to take a look at articles that affirmed true claims, since that's also an important part of the fact-checking process as well. And then finally, we wanted to see whether this pattern would generalize to other materials. So in this final study, we drew articles from politifact.com, another prominent fact-checking website, here that look a little bit more at the political domain, like you see here at the bottom. And again, we wanted to focus on two key outcomes. One, what are people's memory for the details in the article? And two, what are people's overall beliefs about the accuracy of the claim that the fact-checking article is evaluating? Again, I'm going to present those on the next two slides. So first, again, we replicate this finding where quizzing improves memory for details of the article. When you ask people about these sorts of details that they read in the fact check, as you can see over here, all the way on the very left, the new condition is the condition that I mentioned where participants didn't see any fact check. They're basically at floor, which makes sense. They don't have anything to remember. They didn't see the fact check at all. If they read the article without the quiz, their memory increases and they're more likely to recall some of these details. Again, that makes sense. They actually did read the article and have something to remember. But then finally, and most importantly, when you add that quiz on top of reading the article, it's an effective strategy at increasing retention of this information that they had just studied in the article. Then, in terms of the accuracy of the claims, what I'm going to show you here is the accuracy split by whether the claim itself that was being evaluated was true up in blue or false in yellow. As you can see, when the article or when the claim is new, when people didn't see any fact check, they're able to distinguish them to some extent, but it's not incredibly large. The ratings are still around the midpoint of that scale. When people read the article without the quiz, they're more able to distinguish truths from falsehoods. They think the true information is more true. They think the false information is less accurate. But then finally, and most importantly, we don't actually see any added benefit of adding the quiz on in terms of people's accuracy ratings or beliefs about the claims. So to summarize, I want to answer three main questions that this work sort of leaves us with a good picture about. First, are fact checks effective at eliciting accurate beliefs? I would say the answer to that is yes. We do find evidence that showing people fact checks can make people believe true information more and decrease their belief in false information, even up to a week later, as I was showing in the previous data. Second question, do quizzes make details from fact check articles more memorable? Yes, we also find evidence of that. This is consistent with the literature on the testing effect, that quizzing people and having them retrieve information from memory is a good way of reinforcing that information in memory. And then finally, do quizzes improve the efficacy of fact checks? So putting these pieces together. If people have increased memory and they read a fact check from the quizzes, increased memory from the quizzes and they read a fact check, does that translate to more accurate beliefs? And unfortunately, the answer is actually no. I can talk a little bit more later during the questions about why this is, but just to give you a preview of what we're sort of thinking, one possibility is that these details that we're quizzing people on are sort of little pieces, and to know whether a claim is true or false is more like putting those puzzle pieces together. And so kind of quizzing people and increasing their memory of the details might not be moving the needle on those overall evaluations and those overall impressions that people are getting from these articles. Which also suggests a little bit for us to think about in terms of why these fact checks are working and what's going on there. And it seems like potentially what may be going on is that people need to get an overall impression that a claim is false from a series of pieces of evidence, rather than relying on any one particular piece of detail or part of the puzzle to put that together. And with that, I'd like to thank my co-authors, the RAs who helped with this work, our funders, and everyone else here in the symposium.
All right, welcome everybody. I'm really excited that everybody came. I'm the discussion for the session. My name is Doug Lombardi, and I'm at the University of Maryland in College Park. If you want to check out my slides, please feel free on the QR code. I'm just going to do a quick highlight of these very excellent talks that are part of this session and position the speakers here so that you can ask them questions, so we can spend some more time doing that. So Gail just came in and introduced things. She also probably didn't talk enough about her book. If you haven't read it, the one that she did with Barb Hofer, I encourage you all to read it. Not only is it a great summary of the literature on what we know about science denial from an educational psychology perspective, but it's also an excellent book to provide practical tips on how we can move forward in the future. And one of the claims that the book makes is a refusal or reluctance to accept scientific consensus can impede solutions for many of the problems that face modern society. Yeah, we have a lot of problems. And science denial is a big reason for that currently. So this was characterized really well by our three speakers. Megan and David said that a balanced but opposing sources might be seen as equivalently credentialed, and it makes it difficult to discern relevant from irrelevant science. Tori and her colleagues said that understanding of factors related to vaccine hesitancy is critical to facilitate effective science communication of scientific information about vaccines. And of course, vaccine information is extremely important to all of us. And Raunak and colleagues said that a critical challenge is ensuring that people who see fact-check information remember they checked information over time. It's a key strategy that we use, that we teach students in our classrooms. So we're really great right now at characterizing the problems in these very detailed studies. These are multiple study designs. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Made very, very compelling evidence. So one of the commonalities, David alluded to this, but all of these studies used empiric samples. All of these were multiple studies. And there's a reason that they use these empiric samples, and the reason it was the design of the studies, and they're trying to do authentic and relevant research that relates to how people seek information now, primarily through the internet and social media. Megan and David saw that mediation analyses, and this is from their paper. It's a very excellent paper. I encourage y'all to read it and really delve into these mediation analyses. These are really complex and robust quantitative analyses. Really no change of personal beliefs, and there's no indirect effect of perceived expert consensus. Tori and her colleagues, she summarized these really well, but liberals have the lowest trust in conservative sources, higher trust in liberal sources, and the highest trust in scientific sources. And then, of course, Raunak and his colleagues said that experimental methods revealed improve a person's memory about fact-check information, but not their beliefs. And beliefs are quite important, as we all know. But although we are great at characterizing information, and we're now having these really great detailed studies to figure out what we can do, we have a long way to go, and time is short. There are many factors that we've all been faced with over these past few years. It's great to see everybody here today. I have missed all of you very much. In a face-to-face sense, I've been really happy to see you all through Zoom and other venues, but we've been through a lot. And there's a reason for that. There are reasons for why we've been through so much. Right now, we're having these barriers, but there's some things that can promote understanding, meaning making, and how we think about collaborative agency and action. We need to act, and we need to work together. So the question is, how do we promote democratic and equitable teaching, learning, communicating, and policy making to mitigate and adapt to science denial and disinformation? One of the key aspects of this conference is how to take action. Bobby Kaplan and the Executive Committee of Division 15, Annette Ponick and Courtney Hatton, the program chairs, have done a really great job in assembling a program to not only think about what we know, but how we can affect our communities locally, regionally, and globally. And we're all asking this question right now. We just did it in the last section. So we have weathered many challenging times. And we are still in the midst of troubling times, and I do want to warn you all that we have the possibility of very dark days ahead. Yet, hope remains for all of us. So science denial and disinformation are a worldwide danger to democracy. And we are behind. There are those that have been working on this for decades. They are called the Truth Killers by Lee McIntyre. I encourage you to read his book. I had a chance to review it. It's grim, but it also provides hope, a ray of hope at the end. These are purveyors of science denial and disinformation. They've honed their crafts by rejecting scientific consensus on such things as tobacco-related health impacts and causes of current climate change. These are skilled and nefarious truth killers. What they're saying is that democracy does not matter. They're saying that your voice does not matter. So, as a research and practitioner community, we are incredibly strong though when working together, and that is the hope. We can do this, and we can do this together. We do need interdisciplinary collaboration. We do need to be a team, and we can overcome these truth killers. So we need to figure out how we marshal the resources and the will and the collective agency to do so, and the hope to act. So enough of my preaching. One more round of applause for our speakers.